ونصلي ونسلم على رسوله الكريم أما بعد. I hope everyone is doing well. So this is our 11th session lecture, inshallah. And in this lecture we're going to be discussing, because we're doing case studies, so our last session we looked at trying to implement some of the principles of the taqsim al-masail and how it relates to certain women related issues. So that was the topic of niqab. We briefly touched upon the topic of women cutting hair and women horse riding or riding any animal for that matter, and the way that one can approach the madhab to know where to situate certain masail, and then we can know how we can engage in those masail. What we're looking at today is a topic about which we're going to look briefly at the theory, but then also looking at a case study, inshallah, which is about adopting other madhabs, right? Giving fatwa. So there's two things here that we need to make a clarification for. So one is the taqleed and ijtihad, where there is a question of the lay person on the street. What are they supposed to do? That's not what we're interested in right now. So far our conversation has not been about that. Our conversation is about a student of knowledge or an alim, a person who's giving fatwa or giving opinions or transmitting the Hanafi position. How are they meant to transmit the position? So we looked at the ways in which that can be done in terms of the base structure of the madhab, as you find in Usul Ifta. But then there's always this question of giving fatwa on another madhab, right? Can you say, if someone comes to and you're trained in the Hanafi madhab, am I allowed to give fatwa to a person to say, you know what, why don't you adopt this fatwa from this madhab? Why don't you adopt this fatwa from that madhab, and so on and so forth? Is that allowed? And if it is not allowed, why? And if it is allowed, then what are the conditions for it? Because if it's just allowed to give fatwa on any madhab you please, then in essence the whole idea of the madhab, which is adopting a madhab, kind of becomes a bit redundant, because you can just give fatwa to whoever you want. So in this lecture, inshallah, today we're going to be delving into this discussion a bit more about giving fatwa on another madhab, some of the theory surrounding that, and then we'll look at a case study, inshallah. Important distinction to make, and I alluded to it in the introduction, which is that there is a distinction that needs to be made between a lay person following a madhab and a mufti giving fatwa on a madhab, right? And a lot of the times the discussions are kind of merged together, and it makes sense why it is merged, because many modern day, what we call muftis, they are also themselves muqallid, right? In a very simple sense of like, they don't know the evidences, they hear what the madhab said and they just present it. So therefore the conversation gets mixed, but there is a bit of a confusion here. But the lay person following a madhab and having to be bound to a madhab, that's a separate conversation, although linked, but we're going to, as I said, we're going to discuss that later. The current discussion at play here is that we spoke already about the institutionalization of taqleed and the importance of that. Because if you're gonna let's take all our inherited schools of thought away. So we put that all to aside and I say, okay, from the Quran and Sunnah, is there any evidence that I have to give fatwa based upon the Hanafi madhab? So as a mufti who is a muqallid, what do I mean by this is that if you're a mujtahid, right, and you're the one who's qualified, then the answer is quite simple, that you give fatwa on what you believe it to be correct. You're not meant to be giving fatwa based upon someone doing taqleed or someone else, because you're the mujtahid. So therefore, there's not much confusion about having to be stuck to a school or not, because you're mujtahid. So Imam Abu Hanifa, when he's giving fatwa to people, he's not bound to any madhab. He can just tell you what he believes is correct based upon usul. Now, when we're talking about a person who is studied in a given madhab, and now they're giving fatwa, and their fatwa is a naql, is a transmission. You're basically transmitting what you've heard. So you ask me a question, you say, is al-jam' bayna salatayn allowed? Can you combine between two prayers in safar? So I, as a person trained in the Hanafi madhab, will turn around and say, Imam Abu Hanifa said, or the Hanafi position here is that al-jam' bayna salatayn is not allowed. Al-jam' al-haqiqi is not allowed. But what evidence is there, what shari'i evidence is there to prevent me from saying, but Imam Shafi'i has said that al-jam' bayna salatayn as-safar is allowed? Both of them do taqleed. I don't know the evidence for both, right? In this case, let's say, right? And I'm just citing to you, I know there's two opinions. Why am I restricted to giving fatwa or transmitting a fatwa to you based on what Imam Hanifa said and not what Imam Shafi'i said? The reality is that the thing that prevents me is not to do with any Quranic ayat or hadith. You can't cite any clear evidence to say you are bound to give fatwa based upon what your madhab said. You're going to find a verse of Quran or hadith to establish that. So therefore, trying to even go down that route is quite a, it will be a route for which, it's a route for which there's a lot of, it's a route which is going to cause you more embarrassment when you try to provide certain ayat or certain hadith, or you say, for example, that, the people of Medina or people of Mecca will follow the fatwa Ibn Abbas, or Abdullah Mas'ud will give fatwa what Umar Khattab said. These are personal practices that they would do, but there's no shari'i thing that was binding them to them. So if you're living in Mecca and you go to Abdullah, let's say someone comes to ask you a question, there's nothing to say you are restricted to what Ibn Abbas has said, or Zayd ibn Thabit, etc. You can choose to restrict yourself, but there's no shari'i anything in the sharia mandating that. Therefore, all the reasons for this are to do with practical concerns, right? And this is not to dismiss the idea. No, it's rational, practical concerns for which, just like, for example, we say, what evidence do you have that you have to have studied in a madrasa or studied with mashayikh, right, for you to give fatwa? What evidence do you have that you must have license before? There's no explicit evidence mandating that. I'm not talking about encouraging. You can provide evidence of, how Sahaba learn and how, revelation was given to Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam is all based upon transmission. But what evidence do you have that mandates that? Or to say even more specifically that they must have graduated from an institution. That's not to dismiss the importance of that. The purpose of me saying that is because these are practical concerns which are reasonable, and in many cases experience tells us these are necessary. So if someone comes to you and says, I have learned everything I need to learn based upon Googling things, or I learned within the span of 3 months, for example, right? We would say that this puts a big question mark on your authority to speak about anything, whereas someone else comes along and says, well, I've studied in a 7-year Darul Uloom and I graduated and I studied in this course, I've come out and I'm giving you an answer. Rationally speaking, there's nothing in the Sharia that says you must study for 7 years and graduate. There's nothing in the Sharia saying 3 months is too less. But practically we know that 3 months is too less, right? Even though it's possible that this could be a genius. And we know rationally speaking that 7 years is a reasonable time. There'll be some examinations involved and so on and so forth. So this is something which is important to note. So the reason why we adopt a madhab to give fatwa on is for practical considerations. So let me explain some of them. Number one, we spoke before about the institutionalization of taqleed. So by doing so, you have a consistency to law. So a law doesn't become a thing of anyone and everyone saying whatever they like. So if you were to go on, let's say, social media and look at the answers you get exposed to, right? That is what, if in a society, if you were to open it up like that, that's what society will look like. Where every single person, imagine you have a divorce case, right? The wife goes to one person, the husband goes to another person, everyone's doing ijtihad. He's saying your marriage is intact, you're saying your marriage is not intact, you want to pray salah. There's so many different opinions that you will be exposed to. So having the four madhabs and then which have been crystallized, and then having a position process in trying to see what is relied upon or not, even though it's not going to be foolproof, there'll be holes in it, but that would allow for us to provide some sort of consistency. So therefore, you can have maybe the elite scholars, the few, the 1%, if that may be doing a bit more ijtihad, but every other scholar is working within a broad a broad area of agreement, and so you provide consistency in law. So we spoke about that as number one. Number two is practical consistency of training. So the school that you're trained in, it only makes sense that you should be allowed to give fatwa in that school, right? Because that's your training. So therefore, even if you don't agree with it, right, but you're muqallid, but you don't agree with that, I don't really know what the evidence is, I'm not too sure if it's correct or not, but your training is in that. So because your training is in that, you can only provide answers for what you are trained for, right? You can only provide answers for which you are trained for, and in this case it will be the Hanafi madhab or the Shafi'i madhab. Okay, so now that's how we're going to basically, we are theorizing the need to a person to give fatwa based upon a madhab. Number three is the development of the school. So these schools have processes involved which have layered, which we can say, because the question come about, what if someone wants to say, right, I want to give fatwa on what a Sahabi's position is. There's practical problems here. Number one is that the transmission of these individual aqwal are usually devoid of context. So if they were to give an opinion which is not found within the later schools and not elaborated upon because it's not been codified into a school, it's very difficult sometimes to get context. So application of that has a lot of problems. This is why Ibn Rajab was opposed to giving fatwa outside the four madhabs. And when it comes to the Hanafi madhab or the Shafi'i madhab and the other two, you have century-long scholarship working on codifying, elaborating, seeing the implication of these principles until our time. So when you adopt these schools, you are adopting a vast inheritance. So therefore, once you are giving a fatwa in a school that you're trained in, right, it has every school has idiosyncrasies and unique features, which doesn't allow that person to just go and give fatwa on other madhabs, because it's very easy for one to miss out the nuance, or not be able to articulate the other madhab the way it should be. So you are bound based upon practical considerations to your madhab, right? So this is what we were debating to argue at. If you try to go down a route that there is some sort of nas that makes it wajib, etc., right, it gets very tricky. Whereas practically speaking, it makes much more sense. So that's just as a muqaddimah, as a base to why one gives fatwa on the madhab. Then we can move on to the question of giving fatwa on another madhab. Right, so once that's clarified, so we have the idea of institutionalization of taqleed, which would first allow consistency in law, and it loses anarchy, and then of course it restricts a person from giving fatwa based upon desire and just giving dispensations left, right and center. And then at the other side, there's a practical concerns of what your training is in, and that one gives fatwa in accordance with that, so you can pick up the nuance which you're trained in. In the other madhab, you may not be trained in. Now, in Mufti Taqi's book, Usul Ifta wa Adabuhu, there is a section where he talks about a person giving fatwa on another madhab, and so he begins it by saying, he goes, Al-Asl al-Mufti al-Muqallid an la yuftiya illa bi madhabi imamihi, that the default for the muqallid mufti is to not give fatwa except upon the madhab of his imam. And that makes sense, because once you are a muqallid mufti and you are giving fatwa to someone, now for you to give fatwa on another madhab, there has to be a reason for it. And if you confess that you are a muqallid mufti, right, a muqallid mufti would mean the one who has learnt the fatawa of their school, right, but they don't know the intricacies of how necessarily they came to those conclusions. They can't do tarjih between aqwal, but they've learned what the fatwa is. So that person, he's not allowed, or she's not allowed to now say, to someone ask the question, say, yes, but this madhab says this. Or give fatwas by citing some other madhab, because that's not what their training is, and there's no, and why would they be giving fatwa on something else? Right? So they won't be doing an evidence, so the default is you follow your madhab. But there could be reasons in which a person may want to adopt another madhab or give fatwa another madhab, but it's not going to be based on evidence if the person is a mufti muqallid. Remember that. It's not saying that a person may not be able to do so. There are ulama, and there are in the past and today, that are following of a madhab, but they are very competent, very knowledgeable, and on given issues, they may give fatwa on another madhab based upon dalil, based upon evidence. But in that situation, then they're not a mufti muqallid. Right? So you can't say that I'm a mufti muqallid and then give fatwa based upon dalil. Right? In that situation, you're not. If you are a mufti muqallid giving fatwa based on dalil, there's like a contradiction, saying, well, you're kind of saying you're not able to do something and then doing it at the same time. So therefore, the mufti who's adopting the madhab as being authority for him, not the evidences and not seeing themselves competent enough, can they give fatwa on another madhab? So Mufti Taqi in his Usul Ifta wa Adabuhu, the first situation he talks about where this is allowed, he goes al-ifta bi madhabin akhar li hajatin ammah. They're giving fatwa on another madhab due to a general need. So al-halatul ula, you refer to, he says ad-darura al-haja. This is where darura, which is a dire need, and haja, which is a lighter form of need, it's a difficulty, right? وذلك أن يكون في المذهب في مسألة مخصوصة حرج شديد لا يطاق أو حاجة واقعية لا محيص عنها فيجوز أن يعمل بمذهب آخر دفعا للحرج وإنجاز للحاجة. So he says, as a principle, that is when in a specific case there is extreme difficulty, which is unbearable, or a difficulty or a need that has occurred where there's very little way of escaping from. In that situation, it is allowed to act upon another madhab to remove the difficulty or to fulfill the need. وهذا كما أفتى علماء الحنفية بمذهب الشافعية في جواز الاستئجار على تعليم القرآن وبمذهب المالكية في مسألة زوجة المفقود والعنين والمتعنت, and so on and so forth. So you go, this is like how the Hanafi scholars have given fatwa of the Shafi'i school when it comes to taking a wage for teaching Quran. Right? So now remember, there's two words that are used here. Darura and haja. Now, darura, it refers to a dire need, and the rule is ad-darurat tubihu al-mahdhurat, that dire needs, they allow haram things to become halal. Right? Now that, forget adopting another madhab for a second, right? This just applies to when there is a fear of loss of life and limb. So in that situation, something which the Sharia has qat'an, definitively made haram, like the consumption of swine, a person can consume swine in that circumstance. So when we say darura, which is the one that tubihu al-mahdhurat, is extreme hardship where there's a fear of loss of life and limb. Right? That's darura. But that being said, in the books of fiqh, right, they sometimes use the word darura, but for like in a more of a relaxed linguistic usage, which is like a need, a difficulty. So they will say, for example, that I don't know, the Imam Muhammad, he said that, you know, when you walk through the streets and you may get a little bit of dung on your clothing, right? I forget the exact masla, right? He doesn't consider the dung of, I forget which animal it was, as najis. So they say lid darura. right? للضرورة. This is why he gave this fatwa. And other times the term is used, that is used in a meaning of haja. It's just difficult, right? It's difficulty. And darura, which is tubih al-mahdhurat, that's for the loss of life and limb, right? If it's not for the loss of life and limb and something is qat'i haram, right, it will not be allowed for one to do. So the way to view it up, so now I want to provide some nuance theoretically. So now, for example, you got istijar ala ta'lim al-Quran. So taking a wage for teaching Quran, or the Maliki madhab of the case of a woman whose husband is absent, right? So we don't know where he is, lost, right? Or has other issues in which they cannot maintain the marriage. The Hanafi school makes it very difficult for the woman to escape that marriage or to get out of that marriage. And in the Ta'lim al-Quran, the Hanafi school doesn't allow taking wage for teaching Quran. Now, in both circumstances, right, it's not a darura, right, where there is, except in maybe 1-2 circumstances, but generally speaking, there's no darura where there's a loss of life and limb, right? There's many alternative ways to make a wage, but most definitely, especially just stick with the Ta'lim al-Quran, there is difficulty there. There's haraj. Because if I can't take a wage for teaching Quran, and this is my main source of income, then how am I meant to live, to do, to maintain my khidmah if I can't earn a wage for it? And if the Baytul Mal or the government is not providing me with any income for my time, what am I supposed to do? So there, relaxation has been given the hukam. But there's no darura in the sense that I can get an alternative job, I can teach less hours, and so on and so forth. So there's no darura in the strict sense, like when the Quran talks about darura of allowing the consumption of swine and alcohol. So how does this work? The darura allowing things which you usually think to be correct. Because as a Hanafi, we're going to say that taking wage for teaching Quran is impermissible. So if it's impermissible, we've said take another madhab. Okay. There's a couple of things here to unravel here. First principle to realize is that when you're looking at the issue of darura and haja and the mas'ala, you have to kind of view it in a lens of, let's say for example, at the bottom here, we have something which is speculative, right? Highly speculative. And then you move up and this is something which is definitive, right? Qat'i. So you have something which is dhanni on a very small level. Dhanni which is, dhanni which is highly speculative. And then you have something which is qat'i hukam. On the other side, we have something which is a minor difficulty to the extreme of loss of life and limb. Okay, so now if you can imagine a spectrum, what you need to do, or what the mufti tends to do, is that, or what they should be doing at least, right, is that you need to first take your mas'ala and your hukam and put it on the spectrum. That are you definitely sure about this? This is what Islam wants from us? Or is it highly speculative, or is it somewhere in the middle? So for example, the prohibition of swine comes right at the top. It says qat'i haram. So now for that to be allowed in some circumstances, right, the level of haraj and darura should be on the top, right? So when the Quran says, when can you consume swine, you're going to die. If I don't consume, we're dying. I'm going to lose a life, limb, whatever, right? That would be the way you would allow it. If there is minor haraj, right, that I'm a bit thirsty, right, I'm a bit hungry, I'm not feeling too well, or the doctor said that, I don't know if the doctors will ever say this, but the doctor will say, if you eat swine, it has a certain vitamin in it, or a certain thing that will make your health better. You can run better, whatever, right? Increase your fitness. That haraj, for you to allow so, doesn't weigh up on the spectrum of the the qat'i haram of swine. So, it will not work. On the other side, if the ruling is debated, right? So let's say something which we know in the madhab to be correct, but there is a minority stance to the contrary. Right? There's a minority stance to the contrary. So the majority have adopted a position, but there's a minority stance out there which is to the contrary. What do we do in that situation? Okay, we'll pause here and become a last segment, inshallah. I think we're going to have to do another session on this just to, because the purpose of this was to do another book. I'll explain that. But we're going to just highlight this with some examples, and then we can, inshallah, next lesson, I believe, we're going to move on to a case study of Ahid al-Najsa ibn Ashway Tanwi. So now, once we can understand that, so we've discussed now, inshallah, the first part, which is about the adoption of a madhab. Second part, we've discussed the idea that why there will be an allowance to kind of give fatwa on another madhab. And we introduced the topic of hajj and darura. So now what we're going to do now is this kind of spectrum that we built is that let's kind of look at some case studies, right? Through which we can start to have like a better understanding, because what it seems like for a lot of students or lay people is that it seems quite arbitrary when a person's giving fatwa on the madhab, and sometimes it is and it's incorrectly applied. But in other instances, it's actually a bit more nuance taking place, where sometimes people cannot appreciate what the mufti or the scholar is doing. So I'll try to highlight this, and this would hopefully then break down this discussion. So we had this kind of theoretical, imagery that I try to make, which is the level of definitiveness or highly speculative mas'ala that you conclude on, something which is qat'i in the Sharia, minor need to dire need. Okay. So now the first example we gave, which is a Quranic example, is that you have something which is qat'i haram, such as the consumption of swine and alcohol, and then the permissibility would only be given on dire need. And then we can further distinguish that into another conversation, whether fatwa will be given on it as a general am fatwa, or would that be on an individual basis. So usually in those cases it will be individual, but sometimes if the darura becomes amma, meaning this is the state, right? So if you're to live in, like, let's say, in a hypothetical scenario where you're, as a society, cut off from, I don't know, you're living in a prison or whatever it is, right? And they only provide you with swine and alcohol, then for that people, and they can't eat any of the food, then you can say the fatwa for you is that it's permissible. Right, so that becomes a general fatwa, whereas usually in these cases it will be, when it comes to like darurat bil mahdurat, will be on an individual basis. Okay, what's your situation? Or the person's going through it. What's my situation? Then in that situation, this will be allowed for you until you can yuqaddar bi qadri darura. But the distinction is made about if the haja or the darura is amma. This is the default state now. So in those cases, the fatwa may change. Right. Now back to our scenarios. So now, there could be something where you have a majority, right, versus a minority. So the majority stance is based upon evidence, and you have a minority stance which is also going to be based on evidence, but it's minority. So you, when you look at the spectrum of how you feel about this, you may feel, or the madhab or the scholar looking at it, doing tahqiq, right? Because even when you talk about mufti muqallid, there could be mufti muqallid who is very competent, or in many cases has a bit more research, right? So let's say, because nothing is as clean cut, so ideally the only reason why the way this would work is if it's haja shadida, the mufti muqallid can give fatwa. But in real life now, that's theory, in real life the mufti muqallid is very competent. So like Mufti Taqi Usmani, Hafidahullah, he would refer to himself as Mufti Muqallid, right? I'm pretty sure, right? A lot of these muftis that we have, Mufti Shafi'i, his father, Mashway Tanwi, they will say that we are Mufti Muqallid, but they were very competent, and in many individual cases you see them doing tahqiq. So what they will usually do is the following, and this is what I mean by the letter of the law, or the theory, so it doesn't always be applied. So this is how it usually works. Allah knows best. This is from my reading, right? So now let's have a case of can a masjid, right, which of course is waqf, and something which is waqf will remain as such to their judgment. Let's say you have a masjid which is in a situation that is unusable, and so you want to build another masjid, right? Can the masjid be sold? Now, the majority of the ulama across the madhabs have said it's not allowed. There's a position, I believe this is, or is the position, the Hanbali madhab, which allows so. Now, historically, this wouldn't never necessarily be an issue. Why? Because in Darul Islam, where you have the masjid remain masjids, right? And if the land was conquered, they didn't have anything to do. They can't do anything about it. But if the land was reconquered by the Muslims, they return to go back to the masjid again. The situation you have is in the West, is where you have large population of Muslims that have come into the West, and what we're doing here is that you bought property, like a house or something, and you convert that into a masjid, and now there's a bigger property down the street because it doesn't facilitate everyone, and you want to buy that, but to do so you just sell your property, right? Or is it such a situation that needs to be rebuilt, or the council are coming in and they want to repossess it, whatever, right? Can you sell that or not? So now here Mufti Taqi, when he discusses this topic, he goes, well, aslan you can't. But in those kind of situations, right, if there's a real need for, you can give fatwa on the Hanbali madhab to allow it. So in that situation, on the spectrum, there's going to be something that you're relatively sure is correct, but there is a minority stance to the contrary. And there is a significant need for the community. There's a significant financial need for the community to have a place to worship. It affects everyone, right? Have a nice place where your kids can go to learn. People can go and pray, and it becomes the heart of the community. So there's a good need, not loss of life and limb, but there's a decent, there's a strong need for it, and there's a minority position. So therefore, through the lens of how Mufti Taqi is viewing it, he said that's enough for me to say that you give fatwa the Hanbali madhab. Now, of course, another Mufti may come along and say, no, I don't buy it. I very strongly believe in this. We should not go against this because we believe the evidence also supports it or whatnot. Someone may come along and say, I think the evidence is stronger. No problem. Okay? Then there's going to be situations in which your madhab may be the minority, and other madhabs say to the contrary. And there is a need, but the need is not where people are, really going to struggle, but there is difficulty. In some of those cases, you may see the Hanafi scholars or the people following a certain madhab may show relaxation if their madhab is in the minority, right? Because now on the spectrum of qat'iyya to being high speculative, this goes lower down the ladder, right? So for example, the consumption of prawns. In the Hanafi madhab, the consumption of prawns is not allowed. But most of the other madhahib allow it. Right? They consider it as fish, you can consume it. The Hanafis have a more narrow definition of fish. So here you get many Hanafi scholars, right? And the way I usually answer is the same. I'll say, someone asks me, is prawns allowed? I say, Hanafi madhab doesn't allow it. Simply because I don't eat myself, and the Hanafi madhab doesn't allow it, it's prohibited in the Hanafi madhab. That's why I cite it. In terms of evidence, there's evidence for this as a Hanafis give, but fair enough. Let's look at Mufti Taqi again. Because I'm trying to show you that it may look like slightly inconsistent, but there is a methodology in play here. The way Mufti Taqi deals with this in his Takmil al-Fath al-Mulhim, he says, well, firstly, you have, in terms of evidence, there are a lot of strong evidence to say all animals of the sea are halal. So there's a much more broader definition of fish, which include prawns. Number two, you have the majority allow its consumption. So not only do you have evidence that seems to be clear, but based on just authority of the past, you have a lot of people that are permitting it. Furthermore, there's a few other arguments, but I'm going to skip all that. Furthermore, in places like the subcontinent of Bangladesh or something, right, where where prawns are commonly consumed, to put a prohibition on them will be haraj. Now, is it going to be haraj for the people that can't eat this fish, I can't eat other fish? It may not be dire, but it will be difficult. So let's give fatwa on the other madhab. So you can see here the haraj is not high. It's quite low. Maybe for some business people it might be quite higher up, but it's quite low. And because the fatwa of your madhab is a minority and the others a majority, some scholars of Mufti Taqi will be willing to facilitate that. Right? So even though in the usul as Mufti Taqi is harajun shadid, right? But that's not how it's usually done practically, because these are things you have to weigh up. Now, to further complicate the issue, if you like, is that's in all of these cases so far, so the prohibition of alcohol and wine from the Quran and Sunnah, so it's not a madhabi issue, right? But al-ujra ala ta'lim al-Quran, the masala of prawns, and the issue of waqf. All of these, so far, these masala examples we've given are from Imam Abu Hanifa himself. These are positions that he's held, that we know is a Hanafi position. So therefore, when giving fatwa against it, we are literally going against what Imam Abu Hanifa said. And so therefore, there has to be a good reason to it. But like I said, we can view it up in lens of whether he's in the majority, whether he's in the minority, and then we have to weigh up with the level of haraj and dhurura that's on the other side. Where there will be sometimes more flexibility then is where a position comes within the madhab which is not from the founding fathers of the school. This comes in from later mujtahideen or fuqaha in the madhab. They've articulated a view. In those circumstances, right, if it's not based upon a clear nas, but it's based upon how they understand the usul al-madhab to operate, then again, in the application of that, if there's some sort of haraj or need, there can be further relaxation there as well. Right? Like I said, this is not a fixed principle. The general rule is, of the rule and haraj, you can give fatwa another madhab, but practically speaking, these are the concerns that go through muftis. And in each of these scenarios, you may have scholars that disagree. When it comes to ujra ta'lim al-Quran, because this was a need felt in the past, so you have consistent fatwa, the Hanafi madhab to the contrary, we don't have a concern with that. With things like prawns and stuff, which is a bit more of a, I don't know if it's a modern delicacy or not, but it seems to be more of a modern concern, or the issue of waqf, which is more to do in the lands in the West, then the fatwa coming now, so who knows, maybe in 200 years time people look back and say the Hanafis gave fatwa on the permissibility on this based on the Hanbali madhab. So that would be the fatwa, just like it would have changed in the past, it would have changed here. Okay, if the need continues. So hopefully that makes sense, some of this. What we're going to do, inshallah, we're going to go through a proper, I was going to do the case study from Mullah Shaitan. We'll explain that in the conclusion, inshallah. But hopefully that has kind of clarified some of these, the vagueness surrounding this topic. Conclude our lecture today, inshallah, is that we spoke about giving fatwa under the madhab, and the main concern, the reason that will come about, especially from a mufti who is not mujtahid, will be because of the dhurur and haraj. And so that in itself kind of makes sense, but I tried to kind of break it down into a bit more detail, providing some examples so we can understand some of the complications surrounding that. What we will be doing, inshallah, next session is that we'll look at a very famous example of fatwa and other madhab, and just the process behind it, and that will be via Maulana Ashraf Ali Thanwi's very famous risala, Al-Hilat al-Najiza. Al-Hilat al-Najiza, which is to do with some of the concerns that Muslim women were facing in British India, because some of the difficulties that the Hanafi madhab had in a woman gaining separation from her husband. So there's a mas'ala of a zawja maf'uda, and so we can just kind of see some of the processes and the methods that he applied in trying to get this fatwa out there, which now is the fatwa. So if you were to ask the Hanafi scholars, I don't see anyone that disagrees on the fatwa that Mullah Shaitan he gave, but it's just a process that he went through. So there's a PhD dissertation by Fariha Khan on this, which will be provided that we can do a reading from, but we're going to go through parts of this, inshallah, to see what it's all about. So that being said, this is just a highlighting some of the concerns when it comes to giving fatwa on another madhab. Lastly, just to kind of conclude as well, is that this should not be confused with the mas'ala of the layperson seeking fatwa. There's more flexibility on the layperson asking a mufti and which mufti they want to ask than in a mufti being given fatwa on another madhab. Another, a way out of this, which I didn't mention because I was talking about when a person is giving fatwa on another madhab, but an easier approach is if a person comes to you and asks you a question and you want to give fatwa on another madhab, then rather than having to go through these complications, you can shift the layperson to another mufti or another madhab. You say, go ask that person, adopt it. Now the question may come about is, but doesn't the layperson have to follow his madhab? That's the question we're going to answer. And if once we get the conclusion that I believe is correct, then an easier way of kind of navigating through this, if you don't want to be the one giving fatwa to the madhab, is to maneuver them to another madhab, and that will be an easier way to facilitate these difficulties without going through the difficulties of seeing how to weigh up the haraj and the mas'ala, inshallah. So we'll stop here. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.